Welcome to Green Street, where the kingdom of God is breaking through. I'm Reverend Sarah Howell Miller. I'm happy to welcome y'all to one of 3 events that's celebrating our 12th anniversary as a reconciling congregation. So on this day in 2009, Green Street officially became part of the Reconciling Ministries Network. Reconciling Ministries Network equips and mobilizes United Methodists of all sexual orientations and gender identities to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they may present themselves. That last part is from our baptismal vows as Methodists, which is pretty cool. Being a reconciling congregation means that we have made a public and clear commitment to intersectional LGBTQ+ justice. Our welcome statement at Green Street expresses God's radical hospitality in a way that is both actual and aspirational. And as we celebrate our 12th anniversary as a reconciling congregation, we both honor the work that already has been done, and we commit to the ongoing work of justice and reconciliation in the church and in the community. So tonight we welcome a special guest speaker, Adam Plant. Adam is an actor, speaker, life coach, and devoted fan of peanut butter. He received a Bachelor of Arts from Elon University with a double major in music and religious studies, and then went on to graduate from Wake Forest University School of Divinity in 2016. And you were an intern here at Green Street during that time, right? Yes, former Green Street interns. We love to claim them. He has a talent and passion for cultivating deep connections among those with whom he works. Adam has been speaking publicly about his experiences as a queer transgender man for almost a decade, and he currently resides in North Carolina with his partner, dog, and a growing brood of houseplants. Tonight, Adam will lead us in a program entitled Jesus Guide to Coming Out, a conversation on queerness in sacred texts. But first, a few housekeeping things. If you're here in the building, if you need a restroom, you can go out through our breezeway, down the main hallway, and then turn left before the stairwell. There are 2 single occupancy gender-neutral bathrooms there. If you're joining us online, you will know better than I will where the facilities are. This hybrid format is new to us. We've been living into this on Sunday mornings, and so we welcome your feedback and also your patience as I scroll through my iPad awkwardly. And so I'd like to get us started with this welcome and blessing by Reverend M. Barclay of Infleshed. God is calling us out of the places we hide, out of insecurity, out of shame, out from under that which silences love and justice. Come out, people of God. Though we may be afraid, though we will be at risk, God calls us to courage. Our God is a God of resurrection, of new life after devastation, of hope in the grip of evil, and so we dare to proclaim with pride and faith our truths. We believe in the power of love. We believe in solidarity with the suffering. We believe we are each valuable. We believe that our togetherness is transformative. The world is longing for holy truths that reveal, voices that speak real words of hope. Come out, people of God. And now Adam.
Hello. There we go. Welcome. I am so happy to be here, and I'm so happy that you are here. Like Sarah said, I am Adam Plant, and I did intern here the summer of 2015, and it was a wonderful summer for me, and I'm so glad to be back here. So, for those of you who are here in person, I am going to ask you to participate a little bit, so do not be shy. Feel free to shout out any answers that you know the answer to. And I definitely want this to be a dialogue and a conversation. So if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to unpack something a little bit more, please feel free. I'm going to try to leave some time for questions and answers at the end. Okay? All right. So Sarah did give me a little introduction, and normally when I do talks like this, I mostly talk about my journey as a trans person. So I'm going to give you the very short version. I was born. The doctor said, "It's a girl." And my parents were like, "Great." And then 4 years later, I was like, "No, actually I'm a boy." And then we went through some like weird times in middle school and high school, as most people do. And I finally found myself during my first semester of divinity school here at Wake Forest. And then it's just been a journey of discovering and leaning into myself and just being happy, which was fantastic. So, that's me. And tonight we're going to talk about queerness in the Bible, in sacred texts. And before we get into the meat of it, I want to talk a little bit about what assumptions we can make about queerness when we're talking about sacred texts. So we have these modern concepts of what it means to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and they didn't really exist at the time that these texts were written, so it's kind of difficult to assign explicit queerness to any biblical figures. It would kind of look like if you took a Baroque painting and were like, yes, I see the qualities of Impressionism here in this painting, when Impressionism had not been invented at the time that the painting was painted. You get the idea. So we can see those qualities in people of this time, but we can't really assign them explicit queerness and say, yes, this person was gay. And so what we're going to talk about mostly is how people in Scripture didn't conform to the typical gender roles and expressions of the time and were generally societal outliers. So we can't know who or how many or when, but the queer identities and lives that were lived throughout the biblical text are just as valid and they're just as sacred as the queerness that we celebrate today. So my plan tonight is to talk about gender in the creation accounts in Genesis, the role of eunuchs and how Jesus speaks about them, and finally, how Jesus basically gave us a blueprint for coming out. And I'm hoping that you will come with me on this journey. All right. So, when we talk about queerness in sacred texts, what better place is there to start than with the first actual human, right? Can someone tell me something about the creation accounts? Anything that you remember from Genesis 1 and 2. You don't have to raise your hand. You can just yell it. Yes, the earth and the sky and the sea. Anything else? The animals, they were created. What else? God called it all good. Yes. And say what else? Yes, that humans were very good. Excellent. So the way that Genesis 1 and 2 were explained to me was that it was two separate creation accounts. That you got one account in Genesis 1 and then another one in Genesis 2. And that's always how I kind of read them. But when I was preparing for this talk, I was reading through it again, and I was like, I'm seeing this in a totally different way. So for me, what I'm seeing now in Genesis 1 is sort of like this general, overall account of creation. But then in Genesis 2, the author kind of says, wait, let me go back and let me clarify some things. Let me give you some more details and some more context about humans specifically. So the first count, in Genesis 1:26, we have, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And then in verse 27, so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So we've got this sort of overview of creation, like from a mile up, we see what's happening. God created humans, they were male and female, but then in chapter 2, we really get into the nitty-gritty. We see exactly how humans were created and the process that they went through to get there. So Genesis 2:7 says, then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Let's talk about the word man, as it's translated in most of these texts. So the original Hebrew, the word we see translated as man, is actually my name, Adam. And so Adam was not just the name of the first human, it was a descriptor, it was an identifier. It essentially means being. And it has very strong ties to two other Hebrew words, dam, which means blood, and adamah, which you can see on my skin here, which means earth or dirt or ground. So when you put that all together, the first human was a being of blood and dirt. And that is how Adam is referred to throughout most of this chapter, as a being, not necessarily a man. And eventually, God notices that maybe this earth being is lonely. Maybe this being needs someone to be their partner. So God does some holy surgery. God gives Adam some cosmic anesthesia and takes out, what does God take out from Adam? A rib, yes. So here's the thing. The famous rib might not actually be a rib. The Hebrew word that is used here is, and forgive me, I'm not a speaker of Hebrew, but the word is selah, and 90% of the times it is used in the Hebrew Bible, it means side, like the architectural side of a sacred temple or a building. So because Adam then says, "You are now bone of my bone, blood of my blood," it seems fitting that God's not just taking out a rib, God's taking out something more substantial from Adam, and saying, "Now this is blood of my blood and bone of my bone, this side of you." So after this splitting of Adam, this taking of Adam's side, it's only after that that the text begins to refer to these two beings as Ish and Isha, which typically mean man and woman in Hebrew. So, to recap, God creates this being of blood and dirt and all the things of the earth who is genderless or genderful, maybe contains all genders, and then realizes that they're lonely. So God splits that being up to create another one. And it's only then that we get the concept of gender differentiation, of man and woman. Sounds pretty queer to me. Does it seem queer to you? I don't know. So, from the very outset of humanity, we are non-binary. We are gender fluid. We are omnigender. We are genderqueer in some way, which is a pretty solid beginning to humans, I think. All right. I'm going to take a pause there. Does anybody have questions? Does anybody have something that they want to unpack more? I'm happy to go on and on about creation. So please, anybody? 1, 2, 3. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, up until that point of the creation of Eve, of that being Eve, we are seeing the word Adam. And sometimes some people do translate it as man just for simplicity. Some people translate it as human or being. It just depends on who's doing the translating and what kind of their goal is in that translation. But yes, good question. Anyone else? Okay. So, fast forward to our next gender diverse biblical heroes, the eunuchs. Yay! So, story time. I will never forget the summer I interned here. I preached a sermon on the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, and I think some of you may remember during the children's sermon, it was explained to the kids that a eunuch was a person that had one of their body parts taken away from them, usually by force. And inevitably, one of the kids raised their hand and said, "What body part did they take away?" And then it was had to explain that further. So I'm going to assume that everybody knows what a eunuch is, but just for the sake of explanation, a eunuch is a person whose body has been castrated, sometimes without their consent. We have several mentions of eunuchs in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, but we really get some better detail on them when we get to Jesus, specifically in Matthew 19. So, we have this weird little aside passage in Matthew 19 because Jesus is talking about divorce, and then he kind of like pivots and goes into this rant about eunuchs. So it's really interesting that it's sort of in there, and I'm going to read it to you. Okay. So Jesus tells his disciples that divorce for any reason other than unfaithfulness is adultery, and they answer back with, well, maybe it's better not to marry at all. And Jesus comes back with this reasoning. He said to them, Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Okay. So there's like a couple of problematic things in here, but this actually shows some really deep knowledge of the complexity of human identity that we don't often think about people in this time having. So let's break this down. Okay. First, Jesus tells us that marriage isn't for everyone. Wow. Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. So there are some people whose role or function in life is not to marry. And granted, the main function of marriage at this time was for the purpose of procreation, so he was saying that marriage wasn't for eunuchs because they couldn't have children, and that's a little problematic today. But we have a different conception of marriage today, and children aren't always the end goal for spouses. So it was a little dicey there. But let's talk about the three types of eunuchs that Jesus describes, because I think there's some really good stuff in here. So first, there are those who have been eunuchs from birth. This is a pretty clear description of what we would call intersex people today. People who do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies. And it is super cool that Jesus acknowledges intersex people here, because they barely get any acknowledgement from our society today, even though their rate of their existence in humanity is comparable with the rate of redheads. Like, intersex people are there, and we just completely disregard them today. But Jesus was like, no, these people exist. So intersex people were clearly a known part of humanity in first century, and it's amazing that we have this reference to them there. Next are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And this is likely what we think of when we hear the word eunuch. Those who have been forcibly castrated either to prevent the onset of puberty or to prevent sexual function. And we see eunuchs functioning in society in first century as sort of guards. They had a lot of privilege for their station because they did not pose any sexual threat to what I guess we would call noble women, so women of high birth. So they were usually cast as guards or people who were in charge of harems, things like that, because they did not pose any sexual threat. And so that's what we generally think of when we hear the word eunuch. So lastly, we have eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And this is the one that I am the most curious about, because I feel a kind of kinship with it. Like, I don't think of myself as a eunuch, but I am very familiar with the concept of choosing to alter one's body, if not for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, then for the sake of being able to live comfortably in my own skin. I think this is probably the closest reference that we have to what we would consider trans people today. And it's super cool that it's here and that Jesus said it, right? So this whole passage makes clear that the presence of intersex people and people who chose to become eunuchs was not unheard of in the first century. And Jesus tells us that these people have a function and a role in society and in the kingdom of heaven. They're not cast-offs, they're not unwelcome, but they're part of the kingdom of heaven. And so I hesitate to directly correlate this passage with trans people because, like I said at the beginning, the concepts that we have today are so different from what was known about human sexuality and gender in the first century. But I think that we can look at that passage and come to the conclusion that when Jesus meant to welcome everybody into the embrace of God's love, he really meant everybody, right? Anybody have questions about eunuchs? It's not a question I thought I would ask. But here we are. We're just laying it all open. Anybody have questions? Good? Okay, yes. I'm so glad you asked. Yes, there are a couple of mentions. So there is that fateful day that I preached the sermon on. There is an Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, and he is encountered by, help me, I'm forgetting, Philip. You know it, though. So Philip encounters this eunuch on his way. He was crossing through the desert, getting somewhere, I forget where, and heading to Jerusalem. That's where most people are heading. Okay. To or from, yes. So he encounters this eunuch, and he decides that he's going to share the gospel with him, because that's what Philip does. That's what the disciples do. And the eunuch hears the gospel, and he says, and I hate that we don't have a name for the eunuch. It seems like disrespect that we don't know his name and that he played such an important part in this story. But anyway, he hears the gospel, and he says, why can I not be baptized? He's very bold about it. He says, what is to prevent me from being baptized? And Philip thinks for a minute, and he says, nothing. Come on, let's baptize you. And so he does. He baptizes him. He goes down, and when he comes back up, is it Philip who's gone, or the eunuch is gone? Philip. Philip is gone. So it's a really interesting, strange, almost dreamlike encounter that these two people have with each other. But I think it's very, very, very cool. I use the word cool a lot. I think it's cool that the eunuch is so straightforward and so direct and basically questions and bucks the system and says, why not me? And Philip very easily acquiesces and says, yes, why not you? And extends the kingdom of God to the Ethiopian eunuch. Yes, thank you for that question. I love that story. Okay, anybody else? No? All right, so let's talk about the title of this talk, Jesus' Guide to Coming Out. So some of you are probably like, what? That never happened. Jesus didn't come out. But I believe that Jesus taught us a lot about the act of coming out and how to receive that news and the sacredness of that act. So we're going to stay in Matthew for this. We're going to look at Matthew 17, verses 1 through 9. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read you the whole thing because there's a lot, and I want to touch on a lot of it in this. Okay. So 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Get up and do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Whew. It's like a scene from a movie. All sorts of stuff happening here. Special effects, everything. So, if any of you have come out or been on the receiving end of someone coming out to you, you'll know that coming out is messy. There's no rule book, there's no script, and very often people get hurt. I should know, I came out to my mom a week before Christmas. It was not the best timing. So, we have the Transfiguration story in 3 of the 4 Gospels. It was very important and marked Jesus fully stepping into his role as Jesus, the Son of God, not just Jesus, the single 30-something from Galilee. I really, really, really want to know how this news went down with Peter and James and John. I'm imagining them walking down from the mountain like, So, Jesus, you're the, what was it? The Son of God? So, like, when did that happen? How long have you known? Why did you lie to us for so long? Listen, Jesus, I'm fine with fully divine, fully human beings as long as you don't shove it down my throat. Maybe not like that much, but I'm assuming they had lots of questions. Because wouldn't you? You go up on a mountain with your friend, and then some old prophets appear, and then the voice of God comes down and says, hey, this guy, your friend, he's my son. I would have questions. Coming out is a sacrament. There's something truly holy in the way that we make ourselves vulnerable in the presence of others, revealing our inmost identity and trusting them to handle that identity with care and love. That is the precise nature of a sacrament. It's a ritual that helps us come into communion with God and with ourselves. And when we participate in the sacrament of coming out, we embrace God in us, God with us, and God for us. And it doesn't just happen once. I can count the number of times I have come out to different people. I can't count. I can't count the number of times I've come out to different people in different areas of my life. It's like communion. Coming out is a practice, a sacrament, a ritual, and it's repeated over and over throughout our lives, and it's different every time we experience it. Coming out is Christ-like. And by that I mean the act of coming out is a lesson in trust, in vulnerability, in faith, all traits that we see Jesus exhibiting in this mountaintop experience. I think the spirit of what coming out entails, revelation, vulnerability, intimacy, and trust, is something that all people deal with in their lives. Sometimes it takes the form of coming out as queer or trans. Sometimes we find the spirit of coming out as having a difficult conversation with our partner or telling our parents that we aren't going to take over the family business. All of these acts require similar things, and they all embrace the spirit of coming out. When Jesus is transformed in front of the disciples, he doesn't become a new person. He's not just wearing some fancy new Son of God clothes. The outward manifestation of the inner person has become more visible and clear. And that's pretty much the definition of coming out, right? Especially for trans people. The person I am outwardly becoming is a manifestation of the person I have always known within myself. So now let's look at how the disciples react to receiving this news. What does Peter say? Do you remember? Yes. And what does he say before that? Oh, yeah. Sorry. Ken said, let's build some houses, which Peter did say. Do you remember what he said before that? It's something that God said when God created everything. It's good. Yeah, it's good for us to be here. So Peter must have been confused and a little scared, and he still recognizes the goodness in what he's witnessing. And he even does something to commemorate that moment. He makes a dwelling place for Jesus and Moses and Elijah. He basically threw Jesus a coming out party, if we're talking about it in modern terms, right? So Peter says, it is good. It's good that you did this. It's good that you shared this with us. Let's do something to celebrate. But most importantly is the reaction that comes from God. Before Peter can even finish speaking, God cuts in and says, hey, this is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. God is literally bursting at the seams to show how pleased he is and the affection that God has for their child. God interrupts Peter. God can't wait to tell everyone present that this is their son and that Jesus is God's beloved and that you should listen to him. He knows best who he is. You know those YouTube videos where people like secretly film themselves coming out to their parents? I'm not saying this is like that, but this is kind of like that. God gives us the ultimate example of how to receive a loved one's news of coming out. God says, yes, and. God does not say no, but. And God basically says, you know yourself. You know you're the Son of God. Here you are. I'm proud of you. Which is what we can all hope for when we come out, if we come out. When we share that difficult news with someone, when we talk about that difficult thing with our spouses. That's what we all long to hear is, I'm proud of you. Okay. Thank you for telling me that. You know yourself. And that's what God demonstrates here, and that's what Jesus demonstrates for us. He gives us this blueprint of coming out, how to tell that news and how to receive that news. Does anyone have questions about coming out? It doesn't have to be about like Jesus coming out, but just about coming out in general. We're here to talk about, we're here to be wholesome and all-encompassing. That's okay. Yes, Ken. Okay. Betwixt us, as in. So Ken's insightful question is, when we talk about coming out as sacrament, as a connection from us to God, how can we talk about sacrament and coming out as a connection between us and other people? Is that correct? Yes? Okay. Wonderful question. I love that. I think it all comes down to people being able to see the image of God in each of us, in each other. And with that image of God comes a love that transcends gender, it transcends race, it transcends everything. And we see the face of God in one another. And I think when we do that, it's, it doesn't happen often, but like when it does happen, it's pretty magical, right? And I think when we share that experience, that coming out experience with someone who can see the face of God in us, it is most definitely sacrament. And even when it's not, sacrament is not always easy. Grace from God is not always easy. And so when we encounter opposition or a reaction that we did not expect or want from coming out, being able to extend grace to that person and see the humanity in them and the face of God in them, it's a hard thing to do, I'm not saying that I have been able to do it every day when I see people, being transphobic and being just hateful, but being able to do that sort of lifts the burden off of you. And the sacrament that you extend to them, maybe it helps them, maybe it doesn't, maybe they see it, maybe they see the face of God in you because you've extended that sacrament to them, but you definitely feel it for yourself. Does that answer the question? Okay. Good. Anybody else? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is, what advice is there for parents you said children, whose children are coming out as LGBTQ, which is fantastic. I love this question. I want more of this question. Definitely bring me more of these. I think most importantly, and like most, I'm gonna say importantly again. Most importantly is to love your child. That's what you do when you become a parent. Is you are tasked with loving your child unconditionally and forever and ever. Amen. Like that is your role as a parent, loving your child and making sure that they know you love them, even when they don't want to hear it, even when they're going through teenage phases. Just like making sure they know your love is there for them when they want it, when they need it. And I think that's especially pertinent in this time of coming out for a child or a teenager, because they're going to be super lost and vulnerable and not really knowing where to turn a lot of times. And so knowing that you are there and you are open and you are loving them is just so paramount to having happy and healthy kids. And and knowing that it's okay to not be okay, right? Like, coming out kind of changes things, especially if your kid is coming out as trans. It's going to change a lot of things, and it is okay to have feelings about that. It's okay to struggle with that, for sure. And it's also important to not let your kid in on that struggle. Like, you can process it with someone else, process it with your friends, with your therapist, but not with your kid, because they need your love right then. They don't need to know your struggle. They need to know your love. So I think those are the two biggest things for me. Make sure they know that you love them, and feelings are okay. Deal with them, just not in front of your kids. Good question. Anybody else? I love questions. I can talk more about sacred stuff. I can talk about me. Super conceited. But really, happy to talk about anything. Hmm. Yeah. Right. So the question is, what are some things to avoid when people are coming out to you? Not necessarily like fire and brimstone, you're going to hell kind of things, but yeah, no. We know not to do that. But someone who is well-intentioned and is maybe just looking to refine their process a little more. I think that's a great question, because we can say all sorts of things and mean really, really well, but have it just not be taken well. So in my experience, a few of those things are like, just questions like, for me, the questions that I got were like, why couldn't you stay a straight woman? Because I identify as a queer man. And my answer is, well, because I'm not, right? And it kind of just not, it shows that you're not trusting that they know themselves well enough to be like, this is not who I am, just trust me on this. What else? Anybody else have some like examples of well-intentioned things that just didn't come off as well? I know they're out there. Yeah. Oh. Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yes. Why didn't I think of that? Of course. So, invasive questions like, oh, have you had the surgery? Like, what surgery? There's so many surgeries, and I'm not going to tell you which one because it's not your business. Because, okay, so especially when people come out as trans, it's very common for people to feel like they have the right to question what their body looks like and what it should look like and what it's going to look like in 2 years, that sort of thing, when they wouldn't dare ask that to a person who's not trans. They wouldn't say, hey, so what's in your pants? If you don't mind me asking. It's always followed by that, if you don't mind me asking. I see I've tickled someone. Yeah, sometimes it just takes someone to say, hey, think about what you're asking. Is that really what you want to know? Or are you just, curious? Do you need to know this? I think that's the thing that I want to convey, is when you're asking questions of someone, especially if someone is trans or coming out as trans, when you ask questions, really think about, why am I asking this? What is the purpose of this question? Do I need to know the answer to this question? How is it applicable to my life? So questions that I would encourage people to ask when people are coming out as trans: how can I support you? What pronouns would you like me to use? What name would you like me to use in private? Is there a different name that you'd like me to use in public as you're coming out? Is there a way that I can support you if somebody misgenders you in public? What would you like me to do? So basically just asking these questions and then following their lead. Because sometimes people, trans people, queer people, when they're in this vulnerable space, it's kind of hard to ask for help. It's hard to say, hey, I need this. So having someone ask that, what do you need? What would help you? Is super, super amazing. And just like even if there's nothing, even if you say, hey, what can I do? And they say, nothing, they still know that you're a safe person. You're a person they can come to. You're a person that they can rely on if they do need something in the future. Ooh, how do you know it's not a phase? Yeah, I've had to answer this question a few times in my coming out. So this question again goes back to like assuming that somebody does not know themselves as well as they do, and also, if it is a phase, so what? You know, life is about exploring and discovering yourself and coming to terms with who you are. And I mean, maybe you cut your hair short for a few years and then you decide, that's not for me. I'm going to grow my hair out. It was a phase. Was it wrong? No. It helped you to know yourself better. And so if people are exploring their gender, if people are trying to, playing with different gender expressions, if it's a phase, that's okay. It's a phase. It's a phase of their life where they are saying, does this work for me? Yes, or maybe not. I'll try something else. So I think it's important to emphasize that just because it may be a phase doesn't mean that it's invalid. Doesn't mean that it's not an important part of this person's journey to becoming. Ooh, yeah. Okay, so we don't have to talk about it. It's your business. You do you, and I'm just not going to acknowledge it, is basically what I'm hearing. And I think people do come at this from a well-intentioned standpoint, where they're like, I'm going to be as supportive as I can in this moment and say, you don't have to tell me anything. But they are telling you. If someone's coming out to you, they're laying their soul bare. They're saying, this is who I really am. And they do want to tell you. They do want to talk about it. So to sort of say, oh, let's not talk about it, is to squash that effort that this person is putting into connecting with you, to being genuine with you, and to showing you who they are, revealing that sacrament to you. And I think it can be damaging, especially with a young person, especially with a child, because then they learn, oh, I don't talk about these things with mom, or I don't talk about these things with dad. They don't want to hear about it. They don't care about it. So acknowledging that maybe you do want to talk about it, maybe you don't, I am here regardless. You can tell me as much as you want or as little as you want, but I am an open door, I think is a healthier response. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Mm. Mm-hmm. What's the role of what? History. Mm. Yeah. Mm. I love these questions. Okay, so the question is, it's going back to the transfiguration. What is the role of history in that? Why do Moses and Elijah show up, and how do we embrace that queer history in our own narratives? Is that what you're getting at? Okay. Okay, so I didn't touch on this, but I love that Moses and Elijah show up, because it's sort of like, the queer ancestors coming in. I'm not saying that Moses and Elijah were queer, but like, you know, in the narrative that we're forming here, the queer ancestors showing up in support, rallying behind this this young person that they see coming out and sharing that sacrament with them and sharing that space with them. I think it's so important to look to our ancestors, our queer ancestors, as guides for what they did for us, as inspiration, and also empowerment and sorry, something just happened with the lights. God is here. So yeah, really looking at this long line of bravery and courage and resilience that we see coming before us, before they even had the words for what they were or how they felt. They paved the way, and they made it easier for us. They made the road straight. Not straight. Poor choice of words. They made the road clear. They cleared the way. They took out the stumbling blocks, and they still commune with us today in their spirits. We celebrate their lives. We celebrate their accomplishments, and we know that we wouldn't be who we are without them. And I think it's deadly if we forget our history. If Jesus forgot Moses and Elijah and didn't see how they played into who he was today and formed him as a person. If we forget the trans, black, queer women and people, non-binary people who came before us and showed us how to be in the world, we don't have anything. Ooh, interweb questions. My goodness. I don't know if I'm the person to be speaking on this. So the question is ways ways for living authentically in public spaces when it may be met with resistance. So, this is a great question. When I first came out, I had a preacher approach me and say, I'm praying for you. I'm so saddened that you are stepping away from God. And that just destroyed me, because it was someone who I loved and trusted and looked up to, and it absolutely took me out. And it really kind of shook me and made me question everything that I was doing, because this person who was supposed to be in authority was telling me, you're not, this isn't real, you're not, this isn't godly, you're not doing this for God. And at that point, I hadn't really built up a community around me. And it was only when I did that I was able to divert the negativity that was coming at me. I was able to lean on the people around me. And I think that is like a cornerstone of having community and being in community with people, is that when you are at your most vulnerable and you're having shots fired at you, then they are there for you to lean on. And so I think building up that community is super important, especially when you're going to be in the public eye. And so just having those friends who can sort of divert the barrage away from you at times. You can maybe when HB2 was happening, I was getting hate mail. I was getting hate mail in my Facebook messaging, and my friends would go through in my app and screen my messages so I didn't have to see those hate messages. So I think having those precautions and having those backups and just having that community around you is so important when you're going to be in a public space, openly queer, openly trans, and at risk, really, at risk for having this hatred targeted at you. Yeah. Right. What support would you have liked from your teachers and pastors? um, so I came out in divinity school, and it was like surprisingly fantastic. All of the professors were just like wonderful and didn't miss a beat. It was really, really great the way that they embraced my coming out. And there was one professor who I did have who was not part of the divinity school, who well, they did not refuse to say my name, but they did not like go out of their way to say it either. So basically, they stopped calling me by name in class when they had been doing it prior. And I approached them about it several times and said, you can call me this, just in case you're confused. Just covering my bases here before I make any assumptions about you. You can call me Adam in class. And was met by, if I ever have occasion to call you by that name, if I ever have occasion to call you by your name in class, then that's the name I'll use. Which, they just never found an occasion to do that. Until I sat there with my head down when it was my turn to read and refused to say anything until they said my name. I was more of a rebel back then than I am now. So that said, that was something not to do, right? So what I would say to do is definitely have a conversation with them if they're open. Say, how can I support you? Basically like a friend coming out, How can I support you? What name can I call you in class? What pronouns would you like me to use? It's all very much integral to those kinds of things, If I see some kind of bullying happening in my class or in the hallways, how would you like me to approach that? That sort of thing, Just letting them know that you're on their side and that you have their back and that they have this safe place in class and school where they know that they can be protected by you. And pastors, same deal, Don't tell them that they're stepping away from God, please. It's not the ideal response. But instead, tell them that they are embraced by God and that they are embraced by you. And that if they would like help coming out to the people in the congregation, you are available to talk about that, to discuss how you would like to do that, if you would like to do that. Just overall being that leadership in spiritual life that they need at that moment, which is someone who's supportive, someone who is engaging with their queerness, with their transness, not ignoring it, and someone who guarantees that they have your back. Cool. I love these questions. Anybody else? I think, yeah. Mhm. Mm. Uh-huh. Mm. Yes. So what would you change about like the general way that church is being done, especially with kids, right? Um, language. I think language is the first thing that kids are going to notice about church when they're here. If you're saying boys and girls and someone doesn't feel like a boy or a girl, then maybe they don't feel like they can be a part of this church, that they could be a part of this group. Using inclusive language like friends or children or whatever kind of inclusive language that doesn't differentiate boys and girls. I think is super important for children to hear. Uh, Talking about queerness and transness in church, I think, is important for kids and adults. You know, maybe including in a sermon or in liturgy the idea of partners or husbands and husbands and wives and, you know, men and women and non-binary people, just having those little things in there, because anybody can put a welcoming mission statement on their church sign and say everyone's welcome. But there have been so many churches that have done that and then not been welcoming to the people who really need to be welcomed, that it's hard to trust that they really mean that everyone is welcome. So really embodying that in what you do, what you say, how you act, how you welcome people is what will really tune people into, oh, I am safe here. I am welcome here. This is a place for me. I think Green Street does that wonderfully. Cool. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, so sort of extending that into how parents are teaching their children about God and um, mm, so having an inclusive view of God. Yeah. So I will not pretend to be an expert on children or on early education, but I think it's never too early to start modeling that example for children of using inclusive language for God, using all pronouns for God. You know, you can call God he, you can call God she, call God they, call God God. Maybe God doesn't have pronouns. And really just exploring that language with them as they are acquiring language, because they're gonna be soaking up that language as they as they learn English, and they're learning about what words mean. They're gonna hear you using those words, and they're gonna absorb that and acquire that in the part of their brain that's like, oh, God can be anything. God doesn't have to be a white man in the sky, right? Yeah, I think that's a great question. Did I answer your question? Okay, perfect. Cool. Well, I think that wraps it up. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad that people showed up. It was wonderful. And thank you for people who are watching on Facebook. Hi. Hi, Mom.
Thank you so much, Adam. And I, going to do a weird Methodist thing real quick. So in Methodism, we talk about justifying, sanctifying, and prevenient grace. Justifying grace being when we come to faith. Sanctifying is the lifelong growth in grace. And then prevenient is the grace that comes before us. And so we've talked a lot about coming out, I think, is kind of like the justifying, and sanctifying is how we live into that. And then prevenient grace, before all of this, how do we make ourselves welcoming to people when they come out and before? How do we lay the foundation? And so I think a lot of these practices that we've talked about are helpful not only when someone comes out, but in creating an atmosphere where people can come out. So I want to issue that challenge to all of us and to the church to become safe spaces for people like Adam, for anybody who needs to come out in whatever way to do that. So thank you all for being with us tonight, and hope you'll come back on Wednesday. Ken is going to be with us with a talk called Black Temple's Queer Spirits. And so we're really excited about that. That'll be 7 o'clock here in the sanctuary and online. So thank y'all for being here. Thanks, Adam.